Organizational behavior professor here at Yale SOM, and I have the privilege and honor of welcoming you and those of you who are viewing us online to today's session. This is part of our Convening Yale series, where we bring distinguished faculty from around Yale to speak about issues that really matter. And it's hard to imagine an issue that really matters more than the one we're going to talk about today, racial justice in America. And it's hard to imagine a speaker who is more equipped to illuminate that issue than our guest today. James Forman Jr., a member of the faculty of the Yale Law School, is, I think, uniquely well positioned to help us understand both the challenges and the policy options that we face in trying to attain a more equitable and humane criminal justice system in this country. This is the subject of his recent book, Locking Up Our Own, which I had the good fortune to read on a plane this weekend. I'm told also, although I get no commission, that it's for sale outside on your way out. It's a great book, and you don't have to take my word for it. It gets 4.9 out of 5 stars on Amazon. So. Let me read a bit from Professor Forman's official bio. He attended Brown as an undergrad and attended Yale Law School. After he graduated, he worked as a law clerk for Judge William Norris of the Ninth Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals, and then for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor at the U.S. Supreme Court. After clerking, he became a public defender in Washington, D.C., where for 6 years he represented both youths and adults in felony and misdemeanor cases. He loved doing that, but he quickly became frustrated with the lack of education and job training opportunities that his clients experienced. And so in 1997, he co-founded the Maya Angelou Public Charter School, an alternative school for dropouts and youth who had previously been arrested. He then transitioned into becoming an academic, taught at Georgetown Law School between 2003 and 2011, found time to be a visiting professor at Michigan, Columbia, NYU, and Stanford. And here at Yale, he has taught since 2011. He currently teaches constitutional law and a course called Race, Class, and Punishment. Last year, he took his teaching behind prison walls, offering a seminar called Inside Out Prison Exchange, Issues in Criminal Justice. And that course brought together in the same classroom 10 Yale law students and 10 men incarcerated in a Connecticut prison. Locking Up Our Own is his first book. It is a Washington Post bestseller and a New York Times editor's choice. I will simply point out that a passion for social justice seems to be in Professor Forman's DNA. His family tree is filled with prominent individuals who've played an important role in serving as activists for civil rights and social justice. And so without any further ado, please welcome me and please join me in welcoming Professor James Forman Jr.
Thank you. Appreciate that introduction, Jim, and thank you all for coming out. I figure I'd start by talking about what motivated me to write this book, and then talk a little bit about some of the main arguments, and then conclude with a few words on what we can do now in response to the crisis that I described. And I'll do all of that in 25 minutes, and then we'll have time for question and answer, and then we'll have time for your questions, and it's going to be great. I had really 2 motivations for writing the book. One of them has nothing to do with the criminal system. I don't know if anybody else here is like this, but I'm the kind of person who, if I go to a film or watch a television show and there are no African-American characters, I'm often frustrated, and I feel like, where are the black characters in the story? Where's that representation? And I feel that way about film, about television. I feel that way about history. I feel that way about law. So I knew that my first book, I wanted to write a book that had African-American characters front and central in the narrative, not the best friend that dies at the end of the first act, but really front and center, embedded throughout the story. And the other motivation grows out of work in the criminal system. I was a public defender, as you heard, and there are a lot of stories in this book. I mean, this book is history and argument, also stories. And one of the stories that I tell in the introduction to the book is of a young man that I represented by the name of Brandon. And Brandon was a teenager. He had pled guilty to possession of a gun and possession of a small amount of marijuana. Now he's facing sentencing. And I was his public defender, appointed to represent him. And I had taken the job of being a public defender because I viewed it as the civil rights issue of my generation. I viewed the criminal justice system as that issue. As you heard, I come from a family that has a tradition of civil rights activism. My parents met in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was one of the major civil rights organizations of the 1960s. My dad was the executive secretary. My mom was a member of the organization. They were an interracial couple. My dad's black and my mom's white. They were an interracial couple at a time when those marriages were illegal in many states in this country. And their generation changed America, right? Theirs was the generation that faced down Bull Connor's dogs and that marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and that went to Washington 250,000 strong for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And they made it possible for me to have opportunities that were unimaginable to somebody of my father's generation. He grew up in Jim Crow, Mississippi, Chicago. I was clerking on the Supreme Court, becoming a public defender. But at the same time, I could see that while I and many others had benefited, there was so much unfinished work of the civil rights movement. And the place where you saw that unfinished work concentrated was in the criminal system, where even back in the 90s, so I'm old enough that they didn't have the term mass incarceration when I became a public defender. That's a phrase that was created in the year 2000. But in the 90s, even though we didn't have the term, we already knew that the United States had passed Russia and South Africa to become the world's largest jailer. We already knew that 1 in 3 young black men was under criminal justice supervision, and that same report from the Sentencing Project also revealed that black women were the largest single growing part of the prison system. We already knew that the United States, with 5% of the world's population, had 25% of its prisoners. And that brought me to be in court, to be a public defender, to be standing next to Brandon. And I was asking for him to be put on probation. I wanted the judge to put him on probation, to let him go home. His mother and grandmother were there in court. They had been in court for every proceeding. I had a letter from a probation officer, a teacher and a counselor, at his school, and they were attesting to his character. It was his first arrest. And the prosecutor was asking for him to be locked up. And the prosecutor wanted him to go to Oak Hill, which was DC's juvenile prison. And this place was whatever they called it in name. In reality, it was a dungeon. No functioning school, no job training programs, drugs and violence rampant. It was a place where you always left worse than when you went in. And the judge that had to make the decision in the case, Judge Curtis Walker, and I should say I changed the names of everybody in any of the courtroom stories because I wanted to protect my clients' identities. Judge Walker looks out in the courtroom, and what does he see? He sees a young black man, Brandon, facing sentencing. That's the norm. In D.C., if you go to criminal court and look who's being prosecuted, you would think that no white people lived in D.C., or if that they do, they don't commit crimes. And neither of those things is true. There's an African-American defense lawyer, that's me. There's a black prosecutor. The judge himself is African-American. This is not unusual in Washington, D.C. 40% of the judges are African-American. And he looks at Brandon and he says, son, Mr. Forman has been telling me that you've had a tough life, that you deserve a second chance. Well, let me tell you about tough. Let me tell you about Jim Crow. The judge had been a child in those years, and he proceeds to tell Brandon about what that was like. And then he wraps up and he says, so here's the thing, son. People fought, they marched, they died for your freedom. Dr. King died for your freedom. And I tell you this, he didn't die for you to be running and gunning and thugging and carrying on and embarrassing your family and embarrassing your community. No, that was not his dream at all. So he said, I hope you turn it around. I hope Mr. Forman is right. But today in this courtroom, actions have consequences. And your consequences will kill. He locked him up. And I was so upset on that day. I was so angry, right? The judge had taken the same history that was my rationale, my motivation for becoming a public defender, and he had flipped it and was using it to justify incarcerating my client. But as I worked through my anger and my frustration, which I still have, it's a long process of working it through, I started to think about the fact that the judge is not alone. The city council that passed the gun and the drug laws that Brandon was being sentenced under was a majority African-American city council. The police force in D.C. was and is majority African-American. The police chief back then was black. The chief prosecutor in the city was none other than Eric Holder. And so it seemed to me that even with all that representation, remember I told you 1 in 3 young black men were under criminal justice supervision in D.C., it was 1 in 2 at the time. And so I really started to think about this question, which is the motivating question for me of the book, which is how was it that over the last 50 years, as the United States embarked on an experiment in criminal policy, the likes of which the world has never seen, in terms of harshness and prison building, how was it that so many in my own community, how was it that so many in the African-American community came to agree that some of these policies made sense? How did we come along for the ride? And I knew in writing this book that there were 2 things that I had to keep front and central. The first is I had to write from a stance of nuance and compassion and empathy. It wouldn't do me any good to just continue to be angry. I actually had to try to figure out where was the judge coming from and where were people like the judge coming from. And the second thing that I had to do was I had to make sure that even as I wrote a story about African-American actors and leaders and citizens and elected officials, that I never lost sight of the larger structure, the structures of institutional racism and structural racism and the history of racism and white supremacy in this country that put into operation a set of forces and a set of institutions that limited and constrained the choices that were available to the people that I was writing about. So that's the book. That's the question of the book. We could stop now. There's copies on sale. My son is 8. We do sustained silent reading in 3rd grade. So we could stop now and everyone could get a copy of the book and we could read. But I figure since y'all's time is limited and you want to hear the kind of the highlights of the argument, so let me mention a couple. The first thing that we have to grapple with is how over the last 50 years in this country, rising crime and violence and addiction and the fear that they created, especially in black communities, how those help feed punitive impulses. So people tend to know about the crack years of the 1980s, either from direct experience or from media representations or otherwise. But before crack in the 1960s in black communities, there was heroin. The homicide rate in this country doubled in the 1960s. In Washington, D.C., it tripled. In New York, it more than doubled. And during that time, heroin took a devastating toll on black communities. They tested everybody entering the D.C. jail every year in the 60s and 70s, and still today for substances. In 1963, they concluded that 4% of the people were heroin addicts entering the jail. By 1969, the 4% had become 45%. Now, that's an epidemic. And it wasn't just the numbers, it was also then the fear and anger that they generated. So in writing the book, one of the things that I did, a lot of the politicians in Washington, D.C., local politicians have given over their papers, their archives, basically like dumped their whole file cabinets onto local libraries when they retired. And that's great for somebody that's doing history because it means none of it's scanned, there's no keyword searches, it's all like manila folder and you pick. But if you do that for summer after summer, you find this amazing treasure trove of information, of letters from citizens in part to their elected officials. This is mostly black citizenry. D.C. in D.C. in the 70s is 70% African American. And they're writing mostly to African American elected officials. 11 out of 13 of the first city council that's elected in 75 are black. And you see in these letters things like, I don't know what happened to us as a community. I can't leave my home. I feel like I'm a prisoner in my own home. I'm scared to go out on the streets. I can't take my kid to school because they're selling drugs on the corner. I can't leave them in the park after school because they're shooting in the park. And over again, people are saying, do something, do something. You've got to do something about this. Now, who's receiving these letters? That's the second big argument in the book. The people that are receiving these letters are the first generation of African American elected officials to come into office in the 1970s and 1980s after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the decline of formal Jim Crow. There's an 800% increase nationally in black elected officials during these decades. This is a generation of people, many of them from the South, some of them from the civil rights movement, all of them acutely aware from their personal histories of the long history of under-protection and under-policing in black communities. They know, my dad used to tell me about this, and then I did historical research. It's great when you do historical research and it like vindicates what your parents told you, you know. He said, we didn't call the police. You didn't call the police in black communities in the 40s, 50s. They weren't going to come. They weren't going to respond to a claim of black victimization. And if they did come, they were only going to make matters worse. This was a generation of elected officials that knew about Southern sheriffs in cahoots with the Klan. They said, they were asked about homicide in a black neighborhood. They said, that's not a homicide. That's another dead black person. And they did not use the words black person. So they come out of this history. They're formed by this history. Now they're in office. Now they're in elected office. And they are bound and determined to make the law work, to make the law respond to those letter writers, those people that are asking to have the government protect them. Okay. But why police and prisons? Why is that the form of protection that is offered? And here's where I said up front that this is a story that's about African American elected officials, but it's also about the limitations and the constraints that they were under. So let me talk about some of those constraints. The first one is historical. So this is a generation of elected officials that has been elected to represent communities that because of a history of slavery and Jim Crow and segregation and redlining and usurious lenders going into black communities and stripping out wealth from those communities, and the federal government putting highways in the 1950s and 1960s right smack down in the middle of what were vibrant black communities. In my own hometown of Atlanta, Auburn Avenue, they called it the Black Wall Street. And I-75, I-85 went right through the middle of it, destroying that neighborhood. I was just out in LA, and same story, the 10. The 10 didn't have to be built where it was it wasn't even gonna be built where it was built. But political pressure from more powerful neighborhoods pushed it south, pushed it through neighborhoods that had been vibrant and were destroyed. So they're elected to represent communities that have been underinvested in, have been deindustrialized, communities that lack the resources in many ways to protect themselves. So that's the first constraint. The second constraint that they're under is a political one. So in law school, we talk a lot about the relationship between different branches of government, federal government, state government, local government, city government. One of my arguments of this book is that local government matters more than we've given it credit for in terms of understanding how we built this system and also how we're going to unbuild it. But having said that, there are limits to local government. And you can see those in the book. So black political power is concentrated principally locally: city council, mayors, county council, police chiefs. And these officials say over and over again they have what I call an all-of-the-above strategy to fighting crime and fighting violence. They want more police and more prosecutors. Sometimes they even want more prisons. But they also want investment in housing, investment in schools, job training programs, drug treatment programs. They also want national gun control to complement the local gun control laws that they're passing in New York, in DC, in Chicago. They want a Marshall Plan for urban America. They want the United States government to do for black communities what it did for Europe after World War II, to rebuild, to reindustrialize, to reinvest. So they go to Congress asking for all of the above, and they come back with one of the above. And the one of the above they come back with is money for law enforcement, money for police and prosecutors. One last constraint that I want to mention. And this is a constraint that I think we still suffer from collectively, individually, and as a country today. And it's constraint of imagination. And you see lots of examples of it in the book, but I'm going to mention one. David Clark is one of the initial members on the DC City Council. I told you 11 out of 13 members were African American. One of the 2 white members was David Clark. And David Clark, he had an unusual biography. Went to Howard Law School, 1960s. Becomes a lawyer works with Martin Luther King, Poor People's Movement, becomes a lawyer for poor people, gets elected to local government, and he comes in, and he's not a drug warrior by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, the first thing he does is he pushes for decriminalization of marijuana. 1975, Washington, D.C. It almost passes. It loses because of a coalition of black ministers who don't want more kids using drugs, and a black nationalist city council member. That's the story of chapter 1 in the book. But that's not the point for these purposes, is that David Clark was not a drug warrior. Now it's early 80s, a few years later, and he's head of the city council. And the letters have picked up in number because heroin, which had sort of stepped back in the 70s, is now back in force in the early 80s. And you see, and I don't endorse the language of these letters, but you see people, say, there's a junkie on my stoop, there's a junkie on the corner. They're nodding off, they're taking up space, they're bothering me on my way to school, my way to work. They're gathering in the alleys. DC has a lot of alleys. They're gathering in the alleys where I park my car. And over again, this refrain of do something. You got to do something. So David Clark, responsible elected official, he takes all these letters and he forwards them to the head of relevant government agency. He then gets a letter back. Councilmember Clark, we got your letter. We heard about this citizen complaint about this drug activity. We're on the case. Clark then takes those letters and he sends them back to the citizen. Now, this is good constituent services on one level. I mean, I write my local elected officials and, the most I get is like an auto reply. But who does he send the letters to? Does he send them to, the letters, remember, are about junkies on the corner, addicts. Does he send them to the Department of Mental Health, Department of Addiction Services, drug treatment, drug rehabilitation counseling? No. He sends them to the police chief. Because even somebody who's not a drug warrior, he is an American. And like so many of us, he's constrained by his imagination. He's come reflexively to think of the problem of an addict in public space as a law enforcement problem. Which, of course, then, his decision to send them there just justifies further investment in law enforcement resources as opposed to the other social services that we could have invested that money in. So that's the argument of the book, in broad strokes. There's some stuff on class distinctions within black communities and how they matter for this conversation. There's a chapter on the rise of black police officers, finding that the demand for black officers goes back a century and has always been part of the civil rights struggle, and then the disappointment that hiring more black officers hasn't made more of a difference in how police conduct themselves. But let me stop on the sort of summarizing the argument, and let me just then offer a couple concluding thoughts about going forward. So I guess at the broad level, the first thing that I want to say is that, before we get into any details, is that one of the arguments of this book is that although it's tempting to think of this problem as a problem that was built by a single president or a particular piece of legislation to focus on the Clinton crime bill or Richard Nixon or Ronald Reagan or the 100-to-1 crack cocaine distinction, that in fact, the way to understand this problem of 2.2 million people in prison, 7 million people under criminal justice system, the largest prison system in the world, the way to understand that is if over 50 years collectively as a society, almost every aspect of our criminal justice system, police, prosecutors, judges, legislators, probation officers, parole officers, if everybody in the system, and then people outside of the system, universities, employers, housing agencies, if everybody collectively becomes harsher, becomes more punitive, that nobody has to change their behavior that much. Each actor in the system can become 10, 15, 20%, sometimes even imperceptibly harsher. But if everyone does it collectively over 50 years across 50 states and 3,000 counties and the federal government, we get mass incarceration. The other thing about that is it's going to have to be undone the same way. And the other thing about that is that there are no bubbles. There's no exception. So this, Jim and I both spent some time in California, you more than me. I was just out there for a year. And this comes up in Connecticut and Massachusetts. This comes up everywhere, but it comes up a lot in California. I was talking to one of my neighbors after the election, and he was as I was living in Berkeley, and like the whole city of Berkeley was like, oh, Trump, 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 Trump. So my mentor was like, Trump, 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 Trump. I'm so upset. And I said, yes, me too. But here's the thing, my issues are state issues. Education and criminal justice, these are state and local issues. And there's a lot we can do at the state level. The federal government, 12% of the people in our prison system are in the federal prisons. 88% are in state prisons. So DC is a sideshow in some ways. So focus on, and he said, yes, you're right. If I lived in Alabama or Arkansas or Oklahoma, if I lived in one of those Trump states, I could work on these issues, but I live in the liberal bastion of Berkeley and the liberal bastion of California. And I said, no, sir, no, sir. This is a national problem. I had just come back from San Quentin, one of the oldest prisons in the country, the oldest prison in California, talking to a whole bunch of guys serving life, some of them for serious offenses, but they were still in there for too long. It was like a geriatric ward. Others in there for 3 strikes and you're out. Some of them for nonviolent offenses. They were all put there, I told my neighbor, by choices that were made by the state of California and the voters of the state of California, so you can't blame somebody else for the problem. We have to own it collectively, and we have to ask ourselves, what can we individually and collectively do in response? Since I'm in, there's lots of things that maybe in the Q&A we'll talk about some of the law and the policy reforms. But since I'm here, I want to say something about employment and businesses. One of the most powerful things that you can do to keep somebody from being incarcerated in the first instance and then avoid becoming reincarcerated if they have been released is a job, a good job. The Ford Foundation does this amazing work on criminal justice reform around the world. And they were giving a presentation at a prison in New York State. And at the end of the presentation, and the whole leadership of the Ford Foundation was there, it was a big deal. At the end of the presentation, one of the prisoners raised his hand. And he said, thank you for that presentation. I just have one question. When I get out, could I get hired at the Ford Foundation? And there was silence in the room. Because although they were doing this amazing work around the world, like a lot of people, they hadn't looked at home. And they hadn't asked the question, well, what kind of exclusions do they have in their own HR policies that make it impossible for somebody to ever get hired because they have a criminal record? To their credit, the Ford Foundation did what most employers have not done. They scrubbed their HR policies from top to bottom. They got rid of about 90% of the exclusions. And they went further than that. They set up paid internships with good benefits and a promise of full-time employment at the end, and they explicitly market those internships towards people who are in prison or coming out of prison. And that's part of it, is that in this world where we have stigmatized and ostracized people with criminal records for so long, those of us that are at universities, that are running businesses, that are running nonprofits that hire people, we have to not just ban the box. We have to not just get rid of the initial exclusion. We have to go further and signal and communicate to people that we will look at your application in its fullness. We will consider you, of course, the fact of the criminal conviction is one of the things that will be considered. It's not irrelevant. But we will consider you as a whole person. I think that universities have the same obligation when we're thinking about who we accept into schools. I just spent the last 2 months, involved in campaigning on behalf of admission to the bar to another one of our Yale graduates in the law school. Some of you may have followed his story, Dwayne Betts, who was recently admitted. I've written about this in the context of a woman named Michelle Jones, who applied to graduate school, was accepted, but then it was overridden by a committee at Harvard, and she's now at NYU. If you want to read more about that, I have a piece in the New York Times about it. We can also, in the world of nonprofits and in the world of businesses, we can go further than that. There are an increasing number of socially responsible businesses that are actually doing things like Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles, where they're actually specifically going out and they're saying, we're actually going to try to create a business model that very self-consciously promotes the fact that we're hiring people, we're giving second chances to people that have been in gangs or that have been incarcerated. And for those of you that are inclined in that direction, I would look at that Homeboy Industries in particular, and there are other models. We can talk about that afterwards. The last thing I'll say, and then I want to stop for discussion, is, and this isn't a particular policy idea necessarily, but it is a way of thinking about a problem. And it comes from a conversation I had with my dad. A few years before he passed away, we watched a movie, and it was a movie about the civil rights movement. And when the movie was over, I asked him what did he think about the film. And he said he liked it. The film passed that earlier test I mentioned to you about African-American characters, so that was good. He liked the film, he liked the history they were presenting. But he said the one thing that I didn't like about it is that they made it seem like everybody was in the movement and on the side of the movement. And he said it wasn't like that. He said it was lonely and unpopular being a civil rights activist in the early 1960s. When I would go on to college campuses, he said people would push me off campus saying, we don't want you taking students away from their studies, exposing them to risks. He said, even people that agree with the goal of ending segregation would say, well, we disagree with your tactics, we disagree with the civil disobedience. Martin Luther King, right? Martin Luther King was asked in a national poll in 1966, they did Gallup poll, favorable, unfavorable ratings. Dr. King was 2/3 unfavorable, 1/3 favorable. So my dad's point was, and this is kind of how he wrapped it up, my dad had a very long, circular way of communicating, but then he would get to the wrap it up thing. And he wrapped it up and he said, so this is the thing. When you are facing an apparently insurmountable obstacle, people will tell you that change is impossible. And then you'll fight, you'll advocate, you'll do everything you can, you'll legislate, you'll litigate, you'll start businesses, you'll do everything you can to try to respond to that problem and overcome that problem, and you'll win. And then the same people that told you that the change was impossible will tell you, oh, that was inevitable. I knew that was going to happen. And then they'll make a movie about it. So I don't know kind of who in the room is going to lead us in that way. But I think that one of you or a group of you collectively will. And I just want to say, and it's on tape so you can hold me to it, that when you challenge racial injustice in the criminal system, when you challenge mass incarceration, when you challenge a thing that people said could not be defeated, and you win, and they make your movie, I'll be in the front row with the popcorn. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me throw one or two questions at you, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I'm curious what the reaction to your argument has been among Black opinion leaders, politicians, criminologists, judges. Do they castigate you for suggesting that people of color played some role in fostering or enforcing policies that have had such a negative impact on the African American community?
Well, I guess I would say, so when you say they, like one of the both explicit and implicit points in the book is that there is no they, in the sense that there's a huge diversity of opinion, of position, of perspective among the groups that you discussed, right? The African American opinion leaders, judges, that whole category that you laid out, right? Because in every chapter that I tell, which all the chapters are organized around a different issue that helped produce mass incarceration. So there's a chapter on mandatory minimums, there's a chapter on aggressive policing, there's a chapter on gun control, there's a chapter on marijuana decriminalization. That in all of those, it's contested, right? So each thing it's not 100%. They're all debated, and some of these debates are close. Like I told you, marijuana decriminalization, right? It almost passed. So even though the basic story is that it didn't pass, and that's another example of choosing harshness when you could have chosen leniency, I present the arguments on both sides, and I show the fight, and I show why people disagreed. So I guess I just want to say that I've gotten lots of different reactions. Lots of people, so I'll give you some of the varieties of reactions. So some people say a version of, I'm super glad you're talking about this. This is a big issue. I talk about it all the time. We talk about it at the dinner table. I talk about it among my friends, but nobody's really put it out there in a good way in a book form, and I'm glad that it's there. So that's a version that I get. I get some version from people who say, these are people that were the former prosecutors, former judges especially. They'll say, I'm represented in the book. Like Judge Walker, that was me. And some of those people say, and granted there's a selection bias here, right? Because the people that aren't going to have this reaction are less likely to be talking to me. But some of them say, and I think I went too far. And I appreciate, and your book helped me see some of the mistakes that we made. I think that other people, and in general, I would say that I was very self-conscious when I was writing the book, and I said this up front in the talk, and it's in the book, but that's one of the reasons why it was so important to me to emphasize the larger structural forces that limited the options available to the people that I was writing about. Because what I didn't want, I wanted to avoid what one of my friends called the Fox News problem, which was like, how is your argument going to get co-opted by Fox News? Is somebody going to take your argument and going to say, well, because of what you said, then that's evidence either that these are good policies, or they're evidence that the policies aren't racist, right? Those are the two places you could go. And I think that, I try to make very clear in the writing why both of those. You can't use my book for either of those arguments. You can't use it for the idea that these are good policies, because each of the chapters is built also around statistics and individual stories that show the harm that some of these policies cause, while being honest and authentic about the motivations that people had for passing them. I also am showing the costs. And on the point about whether these policies can be racist, I make clear that you can have different motivations for the same outcome. And so the people that I'm writing about can want to do this for reasons that grow out of care and concern for the Black community. But that doesn't mean that there's not somebody else out there, and indeed I know that there are people out there that might end up pushing the same thing for either a reason of kind of like explicit motivation, or typically more likely, I think it's like indifference to Black suffering. It's more of an implicit or an unintentional but still very powerful bias, but it's there. So I haven't had, so those have been largely the forms of reaction. And having said all of that, I want to go back to a point that I kind of buried in the middle, but I know there's some, and that's what all the written reviews that have taken up this issue have said. But having said all that, I know that there's somebody out there that might have that reaction, they just don't tell me about it. Maybe they'll, I don't want to encourage this, but maybe they'll go on Amazon one day and like say it and then lower the aggregate, which I'm hoping doesn't happen.
4.85, right? Well, uncharacteristically, I'm going to exercise self-control here, because I have pages and pages of questions that I would love to ask. But let me throw it open to the audience. And because folks are following online, I've been instructed to ask you to use your microphones when you pose a question so that everyone can hear it. Please.
I actually wanted to ask about reactions that you've had to you personally. Coming from Yale, obviously people have certain ideas about Yale, that level of education. I think folks have some sense of the sort of class bracket that could put a person in. So I wonder, obviously you've done a lot of archival research, but any interviews you've done, how have people reacted to you personally, taking into consideration your education and sort of possible class? And have you gotten any reactions from folks where they're saying, or sort of thinking about questions like, what kind of school do your children go to, or what kind of street do you live on? And a reaction where it's sort of like people saying, like, whose streets are you addressing in the book? That sort of thing.
I definitely haven't gotten any of the second thing that you mentioned, but on the first one, I don't think, so the interviews that I conducted were mostly of people that were involved in making the decisions. So the interviews that I conducted were mostly of college educated, law school educated, business school educated individuals who, they know I'm a professor at Yale and that I had been a public defender. They know my background. A lot of them I know at some level, or if I got to actually sit down with them was because somebody introduced us by email and told them who I was. So they know a little bit about my perspective, right? They know some things coming in. They know that I'm a former public defender who's very critical of the criminal justice system's harshness. They know that I'm a Yale professor, right? They know that I'm writing a book about this topic that's really interested in exploring African-American attitudes and actions over the last 50 years. So they know all of those things. And I guess it's sort of impossible for me to know what is in somebody's head when they're sitting down with me, right? Like that nobody has said in the conversation, like I don't even know exactly what it is that they would say based on their realization of my background. Like I'm not sure how that would impact like what they would say, but nobody has said to me, I am gonna talk to you or I am not gonna talk to you because of X, Y, or Z. What did you have in mind as maybe what they might have been saying?
Sure. So, I think that can affect people's openness. It might affect just how people would react to you individually. maybe they would have some ideas about, whether you might be able to relate to certain issues or whether you would personally experience some issues. And obviously that's not sort of a requirement for a researcher, but it can affect, I think, sometimes how folks will react to someone who's looking to have a conversation with them.
Well, when you say, I want to be clear, again, the people that I was talking to were people just like me. So they so they would not have had, I think what's, to make maybe more explicit what is sort of implicit in your question, but you're not quite saying, are you saying that like somebody who is poor or working class being abused and oppressed by the police might, in a conversation with me, think that I can't understand what they're going through? Is that what you're getting at?
I think that idea could be there. There might be a sense that, maybe, you would not have certain experiences that they might have.
I'm sure that that's true. So I'm sure that that's true, right? And those were not my interviews were not overwhelmingly of, so the stories about people's individual lives are drawn from my years of working with people as their lawyer or as their teacher in the charter school. So those are individuals with whom I developed a long-standing bond and relationship of trust. So it's not, it wasn't the kind of research, I think what you're getting at, like a sociologist or an ethnographer, like if I were going out into neighborhoods and I were interviewing people similar to people who are my clients, I definitely think that reaction that you're describing for sure absolutely would have been there. It's just that wasn't actually my kind of interviewee pool. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Is the second part of the question sort of clear in terms of?
No.
I just wondered, and it's related, and I think you've sort of answered it in answering the first part of the question, but just the sense that people might have those letters, that was archival research, of course, and this was decades ago. But it seemed like some folks might have the attitude of, the communities that you may be addressing in the book may not be a community that you would have to live in or that you would have to send your, kids to school in. So that I wondered if folks would have reactions based on that as well.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. Not that anybody made explicit, but you never know what people are thinking that they don't tell you.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Uma. Thanks for being here today. So towards the end, you said, here are a couple of things that we can do as future influencers in society. Is there anything that we can do today as students or as young adults to actually kind of make a difference, or like small actions that we can actually take?
Yeah, absolutely. So right here locally in Connecticut, there's a bunch of sort of criminal system reform efforts that are going on. I think one of the things that's sort of gotten a lot of attention right now, which I would encourage folks to look into and get behind, is the whole question of bail. And there's the Connecticut Bail Fund. So just look up CT Bail Fund. They have like a 4-minute video that's the first thing you see on their homepage, and it's very compelling in describing the problem. So basically, right, so bail is money that you pay to the court and or to a bail bonds agency, which is what happens most of the time, to ensure your return to court. And the theory behind it, it goes, the theory is like, go back in the day, it's like, oh, well, okay, you leave your tennis shoes, and then we know you're going to come back in 2 weeks because you want to pick up your shoes. The problem is what's happened is it's become this whole industry, and judges impose higher and higher bonds on people. People can't afford to pay them. And so innocent people, and everybody that I'm describing is innocent under law because by definition they haven't been, this is pre-trial, they haven't been convicted. So they're innocent under law. They now cannot afford to pay the bail. The amounts get really high, and now there's a whole bail industry that says, okay, well, give us 10% of the overall amount, right? So you go to the bail bondsman, you give them 10%, but people can't afford 10% of the high number. So they sit in jail innocent. Khalif Browder is a name that a lot of people have probably heard of. He's a sort of a prominent example of this. He basically served more time waiting for his trial date than he ever would have served if he had just pled guilty and been sentenced, but he didn't want to plead guilty because he was innocent, and he said he was innocent. So around the country, there are this is a sort of an issue that's really come to attention in the last 2 or 3 years, and there are bail funds in New York. There are bail funds in lots of places, but the Connecticut Bail Fund is a small organization, and they basically do 2 things. They take contributions, and they then use those contributions to post the bail. And then when the person returns to court, as 95% of the people do, they get the money back, and then they can, so it's a revolving fund that people can use. And then they're simultaneously working to change the laws so that a bail fund like theirs can go out of existence, because you shouldn't be held pretrial unless a judge concludes by clear and convincing evidence that you're a danger to society, in which case you should be held regardless of the amount of money that you have to pay bail, is the theory. I personally probably have a higher standard, but that's cool. That's a lot better than what we have now. So that's something that's local, that's right here. It's a grassroots organization. You can get involved more than just by contributing money and lobbying. They have lots of different, what they do is they try to surround the person who receives the money with various support services to help make sure that they have the things in place in their life that they will be able to return to court. So lots of pieces of it. That's something I would look at. I would also look at figuring out, through volunteering opportunities, Dwight Hall on main campus is great for this, but there are other ways of doing it as well, of how to get inside prisons and how to, through tutoring programs, through prison education programs, through teaching opportunities, how to actually, one of the ways in which our system maintains itself in spite of all of the human carnage and the chaos and the expense is because people that aren't incarcerated are so far and completely removed from anybody who is, that allows biases to build up, stereotypes to build up. We put prisoners, like in Connecticut, the biggest prisons are in the very northern, basically the border with Massachusetts. They're as far away from the population centers of Hartford and New Haven and Bridgeport as you can get in the state. And that's so that we'll forget about everybody. And that the industry that runs on maintaining prisons will just be able to go on without any outside conversation or eyes viewing what's happening. But we can change that. And there increasingly are programs. It's one of the big things I'm working on here at Yale. I teach a class, as was mentioned, where we go inside a Connecticut prison, and that's where our class meets. Our seminar meets in the chapel of the prison. I'm teaching that class again this spring. You can talk to and try to get your professors here to teach classes of that sort. And again, like I said, you can go to Dwight Hall because there are lots of volunteering opportunities inside prisons. And that's the first way, that's the sort of way to deepen your education, to deepen your knowledge base. And then kind of based on that, you'll start to develop your own ideas. Because I can come, or you can read a book, or I can give a talk. But there's nothing like sitting down and actually talking to somebody who you're helping in some way. Don't just go because for your benefit. Go because you're bringing something that they want, the GED tutoring or otherwise. Go in there offering something that is a benefit to the person you're talking to. You develop a relationship over time, and then you start to learn. And an idea starts to develop in your mind of, oh, this is like the nonprofit that somebody needs to start that nobody started yet. And I can do it.
Time for one more quick question, please.
Hi, Ms. Mean. As a former public defender, what do you think about Michelle Alexander's recommendation that we encourage defendants to all go to trial instead of taking pleadings?
That's so funny. When you said as a former public defender, I thought you were going to say that you were a former public defender, and I was...
I'm an undergrad.
You're a future public defender. I think that it's a really great idea, but it's not one that any individual lawyer can ethically or reliably ask their client to do. So it's impossible. It's like it would be unethical to tell your client, you should do this thing because it's in the interest of the larger movement, even though it's going to hurt you individually. But if people decided that they wanted to do that, and they decided that they want to do it collectively, right, with a group of people, so it can't come from lawyers, right? You started with as a former public defender. That can't be the inspiration for this concept. But if a group of people that's in jail all got together and said, none of us are going to take pleas because we're going to try to crash the system, which is basically her argument for why this would be efficacious, is that the system depends on guilty pleas. Over 90% of the cases plead guilty, that if everybody said we're going to trial, that would bring the system to a crashing halt. I don't know if that's true or not, but I know that the only way to test that would be a prisoner-led movement that people took up. It couldn't come from the lawyers.
We're unfortunately at the end of our time. I'd like to offer a heartfelt thanks to Professor Forman for sharing his
Thank you.
perspective and wisdom. I'd like to thank the staff, particularly Tim Shea, who put this event together. And then finally, I'd like to thank all of you and the folks online for taking time to be here with us. So thanks very much.
Thank you. And I'll be out in the hallway in the event anyone wants to continue the conversation or have a book signed.
Yep. Can I get you?
Yeah, I'm going to start right here.